What happens when the man who built empires from dust finds himself dismantled by nothing more than a whisper across polished marble floors? The night began with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Outside the glass facade of the Halcyon Court, the city roared with its usual symphony of horns and neon light. But inside the restaurant, the air carried the kind of silence reserved for cathedrals or courtrooms where power and fate are bartered without ceremony. Every table gleamed under chandeliers of fractured crystal. Every chair was a throne for someone who mattered. In the center, beneath a skylight that poured liquid gold across linen and silver, sat Adrian Bayron. He was a man carved from the mythology of Wall Street. His name adorned headlines, quarterly reports, whispered fear into competitors, and hope into shareholders. Veyron Holdings was not just a firm, it was a predator, sleek, fast, merciless, swallowing smaller companies and spitting out profits. Adrian himself carried the aura of inevitability, like the tide or gravity. It was not just that he won, it was that he made the very act of resistance look absurd. Tonight was no different. At least that was the illusion. The Emperor of Capital had taken his seat in the very heart of the Halcyon Court to complete what would be his masterpiece. The hostile takeover of a century-old technology giant whose board trembled at the thought of him. Across from him, Damien Cross, sharp suit, sharper tongue, carried the confidence of a disciple raised in his master's shadow. To Adrian's right, Victor Hale, silver hair and deliberate, played the role of counselor, the one who cleaned up the blood left behind by ambition. Their conversation was a dance of knives, whispers about stock manipulation, a CTO ready to defect, a leak timed perfectly to crater market confidence. Each sentence dripped with strategy and precision. The plan was cruel, clean, flawless. Yet even in his triumph, Adrian felt the familiar hum inside him, the restless emptiness that no billion-dollar deal could quiet. It lingered like static at the edges of his victories, reminding him that the empire he built was less a monument and more a fortress, designed to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. He sipped from a glass of Bordeaux, his face reflecting in the crimson liquid, a man who had everything, yet tasted nothing. The Halcyon Court itself seemed to bend around him. The other patrons watched without watching, pretending not to steal glances at the Titan. Here, power was theater. Adrian was the lead actor, commanding the stage with every flick of his hand, every measured glance at the documents spread across the table. The chandeliers above glittered like constellations of wealth, and the hushed tones of nearby conversations played counterpoint to the orchestra that drifted softly through hidden speakers. It was a cathedral to excess, and Adrian was its high priest. But what none of them knew, what Adrian himself could not yet imagine, was that this evening would not be remembered for the triumph of Veyron Holdings or the death of a venerable tech institution. It would not be remembered for the brilliance of his tactics or the ruthlessness of his execution. It would be remembered for a single sentence, spoken not in fury, but in quiet, unshakable certainty. A sentence that would pierce through decades of ambition and calculation, and leave the great Adrian Veyron staggering like a man stripped bare in the cold. At another table, a waitress adjusted her tray, balancing glasses of water with the grace of long practice. She was invisible to most patrons, a ghost in uniform, moving from shadow to shadow. Her name was Clara Monroe, though no one here cared to know it. She had studied the faces around her, the forced laughter, the tapping fingers of anxious men, the brittle smiles of women holding conversations like weapons. To them, she was a background detail, a servant in a theater of kings. Yet, beneath the apron and the exhaustion, burned something far sharper than anyone at those tables could guess. Fate has a way of staging its revelations in the most mundane moments. A glass tipped, a collision in a crowded aisle, a splash of red upon a crisp white cuff. In that moment, the careful illusions of power built over decades begin to fracture. What follows is not the rise of an empire, but the slow, inevitable crumbling of a man who thought himself untouchable. Tonight, Adrian Beiron will discover that the past he buried is alive, that the ghosts he silenced have found their voice, and that the smallest voice in the room can reduce the mightiest to nothing. More than wealth, more than conquest, it is recognition that terrifies him. And in Clara Monroe's quiet defiance, he will hear it spoken aloud. You don't remember me at all, do you, Adrian? Begun but the ending of one life and the beginning of another already hovered, unseen in the shimmering air.
The Halcyon Court was not simply a restaurant, it was an arena.
Every night, battles were waged here, without blood, but with consequences that often bled into the lives of thousands. The clink of crystal was the sound of alliances formed and destroyed. The faint scratch of a fountain pen on linen napkin was the echo of fortunes rising and falling. On this night, the air seemed charged with more than candle smoke. It was thick with inevitability. All eyes, one way or another, were drawn to the emperor's table in the center of the grand room.
Each Adrian Beiron sat at its head,
Not like a guest, but like a sovereign. His presence colonized the space, filling it so thoroughly that the other patrons seemed to orbit around him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face both sculpted and hardened by decades of ruthless ambition. His hair, though touched with gray, was meticulously groomed. His suit, a custom creation of midnight wool that whispered power without ostentation. What truly marked him, however, were his eyes, a steel gray that never softened. Not even in moments of laughter, if such moments could be remembered. They were the eyes of a man who had forgotten how to see anything but opportunity. To Adrian's left, Damien Cross leaned comfortably back in his chair. Young, sleek, predatory. The favored protégé wore his arrogance like a perfectly tailored jacket. His grin was sharp, his voice smooth. The kind of man who swam effortlessly in turbulent waters because he was sure they could never pull him under. He admired Adrian not out of loyalty but out of ambition. To watch the master was to learn how to replace him someday. To the right, Victor Hale, the legal counselor, older and quieter, carried an aura of reluctant complicity. His silver hair and lined face reflected years of cleaning up Adrian's messes. He was not a man who admired the empire he helped build, but one who accepted its inevitability. He was pragmatic, even weary. Still, his caution was often the only brake against Adrian's reckless maneuvers. Tonight, however, he too seemed resigned to the unfolding play. The discussion had begun long before the appetizers arrived. The target company was stumbling, a venerable tech giant steeped in history. Adrian intended to deliver the final blow. Damien outlined the plan with clinical excitement. Their chief technology officer was restless, ready to resign. They would leak this information to the market at dawn, trigger panic, watch the shares tumble, and then sweep in with an offer so low it would be criminal, if it were not so perfectly legal. Adrian listened, nodding occasionally, a flicker of satisfaction flashing through his cold eyes. The brutality of the scheme was its elegance. It thrived on such tactics. His company devoured rivals the way fire devours tinder. Adrian pursued this hunger not merely for profit, but for something deeper. The victories themselves were his drug, the orchestrated collapse of others, his only quiet against the restless storm that haunted him. He felt the surge now, as Damien spoke, the thrill that always came when pieces clicked into place, when lives were reduced to numbers on a ledger. The others around him saw risk. Still, the plates might as well have been paper for the attention they received. The table was not for dining, it was for performance. Across the room, conversations faltered as patrons tried discreetly to absorb the spectacle of Adrian Beiron, the man who bent markets with a signature. The waitstaff moved with the precision of shadows, refilling glasses, clearing plates, never disturbing the illusion. The Emperor's table was a stage, and Adrian thrived under its lights. He spoke little, letting Damien handle most of the conversation, while Victor interjected with his cautious murmurs. His silence was not absence, but dominance. For Adrian, presence alone was power.
He radiated inevitability like a storm cloud, and the others leaned instinctively toward him, pulled by a force they could not articulate. Then in the performance, just at the edges of vision, another presence stirred unnoticed. A waitress weaving between tables with practiced efficiency, her tray balanced, her expression neutral. She moved as if she had been born to invisibility, and yet her eyes missed nothing. Her name was Clara Monroe, and though she was little more than a shadow in this theater of wealth, her role tonight would eclipse them all. Adrian did not yet see her, did not yet know the fracture she carried in her voice or the storm coiled within her quiet patience, but fate was drawing the lines together. The Emperor's table glowed under the chandeliers, a tableau of power, cruelty, and hunger. Adrian Veyron believed he was scripting his greatest conquest. He could not yet know that the script had already begun to change, that the evening would belong not to the empire he was devouring, but to the ghost in plain sight, who carried with her the words that would tear down everything he thought unshakable. Clara Monroe moved through the golden haze of the halcyon court with the poise of someone who had long ago mastered the art of invisibility. Her apron was neatly pressed, her black shoes scuffed only at the edges, her hair pulled back in a tidy knot that did little to hide the weariness in her eyes. To the wealthy patrons she was nothing more than another uniformed shadow, a body that arrived with water, left with plates, and never intruded on the sacred theater of their power. Yet, beneath the quiet movements and the bowed head, was a woman carrying the weight of a story no one in this room would believe. Her day had begun at 5 in the morning. She had risen in a cramped apartment to the sound of pipes groaning and the buzz of traffic, far from the glossy streets of Manhattan. A laptop balanced on the edge of her table bore the half-finished notes of an online macroeconomics course, a remnant of the Yale scholarship she had once held with pride before it slipped away. Her mother had fallen ill, and the scholarship had dissolved into hospital visits, into debts, into years of exhaustion. The woman who had taught Clara to love books and numbers was gone, and in her place lay medical bills that crushed the air from her lungs. Clara had fought as best she could, but she had lost the future she once glimpsed and found herself here, in a place where the world's elite came to dine and she came to disappear. But if she was invisible, it was not because she lacked perception. Clara saw everything. She could read the tremor in a hand, the hollow laugh of a man desperate to be seen, the wary glance of a woman shielding herself from invisible battles. She noticed what others ignored. She stored it quietly, as if her mind were a ledger of human truths. Tonight, however, her observations meant little. Tonight she was tired, her body aching, her spirit dulled by repetition. The tray in her hands held glasses of water that clinked with each careful step as she threaded the narrow space between crowded tables. At that exact moment, a young waiter, Leo new to the job, hurried toward her. His tray was heavy with cocktails, his eyes wide with the nervous desperation of a novice already in over his head. He swerved to avoid a busser, lost his balance, and stumbled into Clara. The collision was clumsy, sudden, violent enough to tilt her tray. The glass of Chateau Margaux 1982, a bottle Adrian Veyron had ordered with the casual disinterest of someone brushing lint from his sleeve, tipped forward. The wine arced through the air, a slow-motion curve of dark crimson against white linen. The patrons gasped as one collective breath stolen from the room. The liquid found its mark, splattering across the sleeve of Adrian's immaculate shirt, staining the fabric in an ugly spreading bloom of red. Against the perfection of his tailored armor, the stain looked almost obscene, a crack in the facade of control. Silence followed, a silence heavy, sharp, and merciless. Leo froze his mouth half open, terror etched into his face. Victor Hale winced quietly, as though the mistake carried the weight of a lawsuit. Damien Cross smirked, his eyes glittering at the spectacle, sensing that humiliation, even when accidental, could be transformed into performance. Clara held her ground, her tray steady though her pulse thundered. She knew what was coming. The Emperor's table was not a place where mistakes were tolerated. Adrian Veyron looked down at his sleeve at the wine soaking into silk. His hand moved slowly, deliberate, a predator measuring the moment. He lifted his gaze and fixed it on her, steel grey eyes like cold iron pinning her in place. The silence grew unbearable. Every story has a moment when the air changes, fate tilts, and all the scaffolding of ordinary life begins to collapse. For Clara Monroe, it was this moment. For Adrian Veyron, it was the moment a glass of wine became a catalyst. The powerful man who sat at the center of the world stage would not be undone by stock markets or hostile boards. Still, by the accident of a nervous waiter and the quiet resilience of a woman he had once forgotten, the stain on his sleeve was not just spilled wine. It was the first crack in a fortress built on ambition and denial, a crimson mark that whispered of reckoning. Clara swallowed the storm inside her. She met his gaze not yet with defiance, but with the steadiness of someone who refused to crumble. Her voice had not spoken yet, but in her silence lay a weight heavier than the price of any bottle, heavier even than the fortune Adrian had amassed. The room waited, breathless, suspended between two worlds. The world where Adrian Veyron remained untouchable, and the world where a single forgotten connection could bring him to his knees. The gasp that had rippled across the halcyon court still hung in the air when Adrian Veyron finally raised his head. His gaze was glacial and unrelenting, steel grey eyes locked onto the young waitress who had dared to blemish his perfection. He did not shout at first, and that made it worse. The quiet, controlled hiss of his voice cut sharper than any raised tone. "Are you an imbecile?" The words slithered across the polished marble floors, drawing invisible blood. Clara Monroe stood motionless, the tray steady in her hands, her heart pounding against her ribs, still her posture refusing to fold. "Sir, I apologize," she said calmly. "My colleague bumped into me." "Don't care," Adrian snapped. His voice rose and the restaurant flinched. "I am in the middle of a meeting worth more than your entire life, and you dare to stumble into me. You call this service incompetence would be a compliment." The young waiter, Leo, desperate and shaking, blurted out, "Sir, it was me. I caused it. Get out!" Adrian snarled, not even glancing at him. The boy vanished as if erased from existence, and Adrian returned his full venom to Clara. He was performing now. He wanted the room to see him crush her, to watch him turn a mistake into a spectacle of dominance. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded. The cliché sounded terrifyingly real from his lips. "A shirt like this costs more than you make in a month. This wine costs more than your rent. Still, it is not about the money. It is about respect. It is about carelessness. People like you drift through life with no ambition, no purpose, and you get in the way of people who matter." The room was silent. Every fork stilled, every whisper altered. All eyes pretended not to watch. Still, every ear strained. Adrian was on a roll, fueled by something darker than anger. The pressure of the deal, the emptiness gnawing at him, all coalesced into this cruel monologue. He wanted to see her break, beg for forgiveness, and remind everyone present that power was not money or strategy, but the ability to reduce another human being to nothing.
Hey, you? What is your name?
He demanded. The restaurant manager, Mr. Henderson, arrived breathless, pale with panic. Mr. Veyron, my deepest apologies, on behalf of the entire establishment. I'm talking to her. Adrian cut him off. His eyes never left Clara. The words landed like blows, but Clara did not crumble. She stood beneath his fury, the storm inside her crystallizing into clarity. For years, she had carried a ghost. For years, she had wondered about this man whose face she had seen in magazines, whose name she had read in headlines. He had been an abstraction, a legend, a shadow across her life. And now, here he was, dismissing her as if she were less than human. The irony crushed her and then released her. She felt the exhaustion peel away, replaced not by fear, but by an almost icy calm. She looked him in the eye, and the room seemed to tilt. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced the air like a scalpel.
You don't remember me at all, do you, Adrian?
First name rang through the restaurant like a gunshot. Silence deepened, jaws slackened, eyes widened. Damien Cross froze mid-smirk. Victor Hale straightened in his chair, the calculation in his mind racing. Mr. Henderson stopped breathing. Adrian Veyron's fury shattered into confusion. The words bypassed his conscious thought and struck something buried deep beneath years of ambition and denial. He stared at her, truly stared, for the first time. The defiant green eyes, the set of her jaw, they were a ghost from a past he had entombed. The power dynamic inverted in a heartbeat. The titan of industry was no longer in control. He was not the predator but the prey, cornered by a truth he could not name. The silence that followed was alive. It pressed on every chest in the room, heavier than wealth, heavier than reputation. Clara held his gaze unflinching, weary but unbroken. She had not raised her voice, yet she had turned the emperor into a man stripped of his crown. The restaurant held its breath. The empire trembled on the edge of collapse. And Adrian Veyron, for the first time in decades, felt smaller than the stain on his sleeve. The words lingered in the air as he fetched into the vaulted ceilings of the halcyon court. You don't remember me at all, do you, Adrian? They had been spoken without anger, without theatricality, yet they reverberated, louder than any outburst could have. Adrian Veyron sat frozen, the predator's gleam in his eyes replaced by something dissonant, a confusion that rattled the very foundation of his being. His mouth parted as if to retort, but no words came, only silence, thick and suffocating.
Ibre patron che de restaurante, carricoven en lo Garcia del momente da porlante. Levradios illante de terreso, e creando te podrema persone che mejor vele hacer del musicada, y podre correr y hacer dior. Damien Cross corre cantaria por el cosa. Como ser pasa cantó el dorno come Carla se sepe dorante. Eton sun tensa, y tual, y ator la tiscarial como vuelta. Víctor Gel, Ueda, Carol, y ara lual en altal, te que sintia como Adrian Cefopo, con que tene la persone sarpaña navido ten el tedo. Y elegala conta, es con toas en aparsatizá. No po Clara Monroe had already lowered her tray and stood with her hands at her sides, not defiant, not triumphant, present. Her green eyes bored into Adrian's. And for a moment, he was no longer the emperor of capital, but a man caught unarmed in a storm. He searched her face, desperate for a foothold, a name, a memory, buried beneath the layers of steel he had wrapped around himself. Her voice, her eyes, the set of her jaw, they scratched at the locked door in his mind. A door he had slammed shut so long ago that he had forgotten what lay behind it. What did you call me? His voice cracked,
softer than he intended. The metallic edge was gone, replaced by something raw, bewildered. Clara did not repeat herself. She didn't need to. The words hung there, shimmering with implications. Adrian felt the eyes of the restaurant pressing down on him. The man who dictated markets and silenced boards was now cornered by a single question from a woman he had dismissed as nothing.
Mr. Henderson, the manager, tried to intervene, his voice trembling. Miss Monroe said, "That is entirely inappropriate. You are fired. Please leave at once." Clara turned her gaze briefly to him, untied her apron with calm, deliberate movements, and folded it neatly. She placed it on the service station beside her. She looked once more at Adrian. "My shift was over in 10 minutes anyway," she said, without emotion. Then she gave the faintest nod, a gesture of finality, turned on her heel, and walked away. The doors swung closed behind her, leaving a vortex of confusion in her wake. Damien tried to recover, sputtering nervously. "All right, enough of this," he forced a laugh. "Listen, sweetheart, people pull this kind of stunt all the time. Mr. Verone is a public figure. It's a cheap ploy, that's all." But the words fell flat. Clara never looked back. Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the space where she had stood. Her departure left a hollow in the air, a vacuum that pulled at his thoughts. His hand trembled against the table. He no longer heard Damien's voice or Victor's cautious questions. All he heard was the echo of her sentence, the way she had said his name, not with fear, not with awe, but with familiarity, a familiarity he could not place. Leaned closer, his voice low. "Adrian, the board will want updates on the acquisition. Are you well?" The question broke the fog only slightly. Adrian blinked as if waking from a trance. "The deal?" he muttered. "Yes, the deal." But the words sounded hollow, even to him. He pushed his chair back abruptly. The scrape against marble was louder than it should have been. "I've lost my appetite." He dropped a platinum card onto the table without glancing at the bill, and left his two top men staring after him. Outside, the city lights burned against the night sky. "The driver opened the door to the waiting Rolls-Royce home, sir." "No," Adrian said, his voice tight. "Circle the block. I need to think." As the car glided through the glittering canyons of Manhattan, Adrian's mind churned. He could recall contracts, clauses, stock fluctuations from years past. He prided himself on memory and precision. Yet he could not place Clara Monroe. He felt the ground shift beneath him, a crack in the fortress he had spent decades constructing. A single sentence had found the seam in the armor and pried it open. For the first time in years he was not Adrian Veyron, the Titan. He was simply a man lost in the shadow of a memory he could not reach. Rutgers, the Rolls-Royce, glided like a phantom through the streets of Manhattan, neon lights streaking against its tinted windows. The world outside carried on with its noise and chaos, but inside the car, Adrian Veyron sat in silence, a silence that pressed against him like iron. The words still echoed in his head. "You don't remember me at all, do you, Adrian?" They returned in waves, their meaning elusive. Still, their impact was undeniable. He pressed his fingers to his temple, trying to summon clarity. Still, the higher he reached, the more it slipped away. He thought of faces from years past. Board members, rivals, discarded, allies. None of them matched the woman with the green eyes. He thought of scandals, carefully buried, debts settled with discreet wire transfers, indiscretions handled before they saw daylight. But this was not the same Clara Monroe. Had spoken with a certainty that pierced deeper than gossip. She had spoken as if she owned a fragment of him, one he had long ago amputated. Broke the silence with a careful question. "Home, sir." "No," Adrian said sharply. Circle the block. His voice lacked its usual metallic authority. Instead, it sounded frayed and weary. He stared at the city towers looming against the night, silhouettes of ambition and wealth. His empire was carved into those towers, each floor a testament to conquest. Yet now, the sight of them felt hollow. He pulled out his phone, scrolling past Damien's number, past Victor's, past the parade of assistants and strategists who existed to serve his will. None of them could help him here. This was not about markets or contracts. It was about something buried, something personal. Finally, his thumb hovered over a name he had not dialed in months. Marcus Wren. Marcus had been many things, a soldier, an operative, a ghost in the machinery of governments. Now he was Adrian's fixer, the man who found what others wanted hidden, the man who solved problems before they became disasters. He was loyal, not to Adrian's ideals, but to his retainer, cold, efficient, discreet. If there was anyone who could shine light into this shadow, it was him. Adrian pressed the call button.
Marcus answered on the first ring. His voice was calm, measured. Sir Adrian did not waste time.
I have a name, he said.
Clara Monroe. She works or worked at the Halcyon Court. I want everything. Everything.
Marcus repeated without hesitation. Yes, Adrian snapped. Everything. Where she was born, who her parents are, what she studied, what she ate for breakfast this morning. I want to know why she looked at me like she knew me. I like it on my desk by sunrise.
There was no judgment, no surprise. Marcus's tone remained level.
Understood, sir. It will be done.
The line went dead.
Adrian lowered the phone and let it rest on his knee. His reflection stared back at him in the glass window of the car. Not the Titan, not the Emperor, but a man. Rattled, his chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. He thought of the stain on his sleeve, of the way the room had tilted when she spoke his name. His hand flexed against his thigh, the gesture of a fighter feeling for a weapon he had lost long ago. Back at his penthouse, the silence was unbearable. The walls of glass reflected his movements as he paced each step, echoing like the footsteps of a prisoner. The city sprawled beneath him, but he no longer felt taller than it. He felt dwarfed, insignificant. He poured a drink, but the whiskey tasted like ash. He tried to focus on the acquisition, on the scripts he knew by heart. Market manipulation, hostile leverage, elegant violence. But the numbers blurred, and only her eyes remained clear.
Green, defiant, unyielding.
Hours bled away until finally, just before dawn, the encrypted tablet arrived, delivered by unseen hands. It waited on his desk, slim, black, and humming faintly with secrets. Adrian sat before it, his pulse loud in his ears. He unlocked the screen and saw the file, Clara Monroe Assessment. He hesitated. For a man who thrived on control, knowledge had always been his weapon. But tonight, knowledge felt like a threat. He entered his credentials, and the file began to unfold. Each word, each line, pulled him further into a world he had not dared revisit. A birth date, a school, a scholarship, a mother's name. A sudden jolt of recognition. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, the glow of the tablet burning into his eyes. Clara Monroe was no stranger.
She was a mirror of a life he had abandoned, a shard of a promise he had broken, a ghost come back not to haunt him quietly, but to demand reckoning. The fortress had cracked. The storm was here.
The tablet glowed against the darkness of Adrian Veyron's penthouse, its light spilling across the mahogany desk like a confession dragged into daylight. He leaned closer, eyes scanning line by line the dossier Marcus Wren had compiled. Clara Ann Monroe, date of birth October 12, 1999, place of birth New Haven, Connecticut. Current residence, a modest apartment in Queens. Current employment, waitress at the Halcyon Court. Terminated as of last night. Part-time barista at a local cafe. Financials, negative net worth substantial. Medical debt inherited from her deceased mother. Adrian's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. The words were sterile and clinical, yet each one carried the weight of a hammer blow. Education. Yale University full scholarship, major economics. Withdrew spring 2019. Reasons cited family emergency. He whispered the word Yale as if saying it aloud would anchor him, his alma mater, his battlefield, his origin. There was no mistaking it. Clara Monroe had once walked the same halls, studied the same books, breathed the same air, and she had abandoned it all. The following line froze him. Mother Evelyn. Monroe, deceased. Evelyn. The name struck him like a knife, twisting through old scar tissue. He staggered back, gripping the desk as if it might keep him upright. His mind no longer read the text. His vision filled with memory, sepia-toned flickers of a life he had entombed. He was no longer Adrian Veyron the Emperor. He was Artie, the scholarship boy, hungry and terrified, falling in love with a girl who smelled of old books and spring air. Evelyn Monroe, with the green eyes that had burned through every wall he built. Evelyn, who had believed in him when no one else dared. He saw her again in the library, arguing about a line from John Donne. Her laughter had been sunlight in the sterile Yale winter. They had shared coffee, pizza, and dreams whispered across cheap apartments. He remembered the night he told her he would build an empire. She had smiled with unshakable faith. She had always promised to stand beside him, and he had promised he would return for her. That promise had become the first casualty of a mission. The dossier revealed what he had not known or had refused to seek. Evelyn had died in March 2021, complications from multiple sclerosis. The same year Clara left Yale. His chest constricted, breath shallow. He had been in Tokyo then, celebrating another conquest. He had not even known she was sick. He had buried her memory so deeply that news of her death had never reached him. He pressed a trembling hand to his face, but the tears would not come. Not yet. The final document slid across the screen. Clara Ann Monroe's birth certificate. Father listed as unknown. He did not need Marcus Wren's commentary. His mind did the calculation. From January to October, 9 months. He had left for London in January 1999, chasing the fellowship that had launched his empire. Clara was born that October. The math was brutally precise and inescapable. The green eyes that had defied him in the restaurant, the stubborn set of her jaw, the brilliance marked in her academic record. They were not only Evelyn's, they were his. Adrian's hand slipped from the desk, the tablet clattering onto the floor. The sound echoed through the vast hollow apartment like a gavel pronouncing judgment. Clara Monroe was his daughter. The room seemed to tilt. The glass walls reflected his image at him, but he did not recognize the man staring through the distortion. He saw a stranger,
pale, haunted, smaller than he had ever felt. The empire outside glittered, but he saw only rubble in its reflection. A 26-year-old woman had reduced him to this, not through threats or blackmail, but through truth.
He sank into the leather chair, head in his hands. Memories swarmed Evelyn's laugh, Evelyn's faith. The night he promised he would return. He remembered her eyes alight with pride as she told him to chase his star. And then the silence when he stopped writing. The distance he justified as necessary. The ambition he said himself was for both of them. He had convinced himself she would not fit into his world. He had been wrong. He had not just abandoned her. He had abandoned the child she carried. Conserve. He thought dead, had been resurrected in the eyes of a waitress. His fortress of steel and glass is now cracked, fragile. The Titan had fallen, and in his place sat a man who finally saw the cost of his dynasty. Clara Monroe had not needed to raise her voice. She had only required to exist, and in her existence, Adrian Veron faced the truth of his greatest betrayal.
The journey to Queens felt longer than any transatlantic flight Adrian Veron had ever taken. The Rolls-Royce that usually served as his throne seemed tonight more like a moving prison cell. Each street they passed peeled him further from the sterile towers of Manhattan and pushed him closer to a past he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it never existed. The car slowed before a tired, pre-war brick building, its facade chipped and weary from decades of winters. A child's bicycle leaned against the railing, a grocery bag hung on a neighbor's doorknob. This was not the world Adrian commanded with boardrooms and signatures. This was real, and it unnerved him.
"Wait here," he told his driver. His voice cracked slightly. He adjusted his cashmere sweater, a futile disguise against the truth. Beneath the fabric, he was still Adrian Veron, the man who had humiliated his daughter in front of 100 strangers. He crossed the sidewalk slowly, as if each step demanded more courage than he possessed. Inside the building, the air smelled of old linoleum, boiled vegetables, and something faintly metallic. The elevator was small and rattling, carrying him upward with reluctant groans. Finally, he stood before the faded brown door of apartment 4B. His hand rose to knock, but trembled in the air. He had spent a lifetime commanding, dismissing, and conquering with nothing more than his signature. Yet now he was powerless, standing outside a door that could decide whether he was allowed to be more than a monster. The silence on the other side pressed against him heavier than any boardroom stare-down. He knocked softly, the sound almost pitiful. Moments stretched. He heard movement, then the click of a lock. The door opened. Clara Monroe stood there. She was no longer the uniformed ghost of the Halcyon Court, but a young woman in a faded Yale sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her green eyes widened with shock when she saw him. Still, beneath the surprise, there was no fear, no anger, only a bone-deep wariness, as though she had always known this moment would come. Adrian felt suddenly stripped of everything: the cashmere, the wealth, the empire. None of it mattered against the sight of her, framed in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was steady, even quiet. Yet it carried the weight of an indictment. Adrian struggled to find words for Clara. He began. The name sounded strange, foreign on his tongue. "May I come in for a few minutes?" She studied him. Her pensive yet subdued clothes, his haggard face, searching for something. She saw a man out of place, a Titan lost on her doormat. He saw her reluctance, the instinct to shut the door and protect herself. But after a long breath, she stepped back just enough to let him in. He crossed the threshold into her world. The apartment was small, but meticulously ordered. Bookshelves made from planks and bricks lined one wall, stuffed with paperbacks and heavy textbooks. A desk with color-coded notebooks and an open laptop set in the corner. The air smelled of tea and worn paper. It was the home of a scholar who fought to hold on to knowledge even as the world demanded surrender. Still, Adrian's eyes were drawn to a photograph on the wall. A girl, perhaps 10 years old, laughed, her arms wrapped around a woman whose smile he knew better than his reflection. Evelyn Monroe. Her eyes sparkled in the picture, the same green fire now staring at him from Clara's face.
The sight pierced him. He whispered, "I know." His voice was nearly broken. He turned to face Clara. "I know who you are." She crossed her arms, a shield against him. "Took you long enough," she replied, without triumph, just bitter truth. Adrian felt the shame clawing through him. He lowered himself onto the edge of a chair too small for his frame, the springs groaning beneath his weight. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" he asked. The question sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Clara let out a short, humorless laugh. "Contact you?" she said with biting irony. "The great Adrian Veyron." "And say what?" "Hi, I think you might be my father. My mother said you were the love of her life, before you vanished to build an empire. Could I fit into your calendar between hostile takeovers?" She shook her head. She never wanted that. She was proud. She raised me to be proud. She never wanted me to beg for scraps from your table. Her eyes flared. She was right to protect me from you. Dean's throat burned. Shame pressed against his ribs. "What I did," he whispered. "What I said in that restaurant. There is no excuse. It was cruel, unforgivable. I am sorry, so sorry." "Sorry," Clara repeated, dangerously quiet. "Sorry for which part? Sorry for yelling at a server? Sorry for abandoning my mother when she carried your child? Sorry for letting her die under bills while you bought jets? Which part, Adrian? Which?" He buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt truly defeated. Clara watched him not with pity but with a hard-earned clarity. He was not a titan here. He was only a man, stripped of lies and power. For the first time, Adrian Veyron faced his daughter not as an empire, but as a broken father, trembling in a small apartment, haunted by the ghost of the woman he had left behind. The morning light slanted through the frosted glass of the Veyron Holdings boardroom, casting pale streaks across the polished marble table.
Adrian Veyron entered, not with his usual stride of command, but with a slower, more deliberate step. The atmosphere shifted immediately. His subordinates expected the storm. Still, instead, they saw a man weighed down by silence. Damien Cross spread the documents before him, his smile sharp, a predator poised to strike. "This is it, Adrian. The deal of the decade. We leaked the news at dawn. By noon, the company is ours. Clean, brutal, perfect." Adrian looked at the papers but saw only faces. The terrified young waiter Leo, the exhausted defiance in Clara's eyes, the memory of Evelyn's laughter echoing in some forgotten corner of his mind. The words "collateral damage" whispered like a curse. He pushed the pen back across the table. "We are not doing this." Damien blinked, certain he had misheard. Adrian's voice was calm but final. "Cancel the leak. Cancel the acquisition. Prepare a merger offer, a generous one."
The room erupted. Damien's voice rising. "Incredulous. A merger that will cost billions more. It will dilute our stock. We will be a laughing stock." Adrian met his gaze evenly. "Then let them laugh. Draft the proposal." Victor Hale, who had watched in quiet silence, finally inclined his head. For the first time in years, he felt something close to respect for his employer. Perhaps he thought the empire might yet find its soul. Adrian's first acts of redemption were clumsy, guided by the only tool he knew: money. He had his family office erase the medical debts attached to Evelyn Monroe's name. He established a trust fund with 7 figures for Clara Monroe. A foundation, he called it. A starting point, a down payment on guilt. 2 days later, a sleek courier delivered an envelope to his office. Inside was the trust check, neatly torn in half. No letter, no explanation. The rejection was silent and devastating. Adrian sat at his desk, staring at the pieces of paper. The gesture struck deeper than any insult. Clara was not merely refusing his money. She was rejecting his worldview. The silence of his office was unbearable. He paced the length of the glass walls overlooking the city, the towers of ambition he had once conquered, now glaring back at him like monuments to emptiness. He reached for the phone, dialed her number from Marcus Wren's file. His thumb hovered before pressing. He had faced governments, rivals, scandals, yet nothing had ever filled him with such dread as the possibility of her voice not answering. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" Her voice was steady and she measured Clara. It was Adrian. He said the name, feeling like both an apology and a plea. A silence stretched, heavy with skepticism. "I received your delivery," he continued. "I know now it was a mistake. Money was never the answer." Her reply was cold and precise. It was a refund on an unwanted transaction. Set his eyes against the sting. "I understand, but listen to me. I want to earn my place, not buy it. I want to start small." He forced himself to sound vulnerable. "I know you left Yale. I understand why. You are brilliant, Clara. You should not be making coffee because of debts that were never your fault. Let me help, not with money but with connections. I can call the board. I can reopen your scholarship based on circumstances. You would earn it back on your own. Grades, on your own brilliance. All I would do is open the door." Suspended silence stretched so long, he thought she had ended the call. Then he heard a soft, unsteady breath. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because your mother believed you were destined for great things," he said, his voice breaking. And for the first time in decades, I want to be the man she thought I could be. Selectively was not forgiveness, but it was something, the first crack in the wall she had built between them. A possibility fragile and unsteady. Adrian lowered the phone, his hand trembling. He looked again at the torn check on his desk, its 2 halves lying like evidence of his failure. Yet for the first time, he felt the faintest spark of hope. Redemption would not be bought. It would be earned, painfully, brick by brick. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was still time. The storm did not come from outside. It brewed within the walls of Veyron Holdings. The empire Adrian Veyron had built over decades now trembled, not because of hostile rivals or market crashes, but because of whispers from within. The board had caught the scent of weakness, and in their world, weakness was blood in the water. Damian Cross sharpened his smile into a blade behind closed doors. His protege mask slipped, revealing the ambition that had always burned beneath. He had admired Adrian once. Still, admiration curdled into hunger at the first sign of falter. The hostile takeover abandoned the merger proposal, leaving shareholders furious and analysts circling with glee. The press began to whisper headlines. Adrian Veyron losing his edge. Is the emperor crumbling?
Board members demanded explanations. They had signed on for victory, not charity. They had invested in a predator, not a man seeking redemption.
Inside the boardroom, Adrian stood before them, not with spreadsheets but with conviction. "The time has come to build rather than destroy," he said. His voice carried no bombast, just a weary calm. His words were not met with applause, they were met with suspicion. "Profit margins will collapse," someone barked. "The market will punish us," another growled. Damien leaned forward, the gleam of betrayal in his eyes. "The legacy you built is slipping, Adrian. People are asking if you are fit to lead." The words stung, not because they were false, but because they were true. He was no longer the man who fed on conquest. He could not be that man again. The question was whether he could become something else before the wolves tore him apart. Clara's rejection of the trust check haunted him every night. It was not her anger that wounded him still, her clarity. She had declared herself unbuyable, untouchable. In her refusal, Adrian found something sharper than humiliation. He saw the truth. He returned to her world not with gifts, but with presence. Awkward, hesitant meetings in coffee shops, neutral spaces where she set the rules. Each encounter was a battlefield of silences. She tested him, measuring if his resolve was absolute. Meanwhile, Damien crept through the ranks, whispering promises of stability should he take control. He courted shareholders, assuring them the old ways of ruthless conquest would return under his hand. He painted Adrian's hesitation as weakness, his ambition as madness. The rebellion was subtle, but growing. He refused to fight on their terms. No smear campaigns, no sudden firings. Instead, he began dismantling the empire of fear he had ruled for years. He listened more, he delegated, he allowed voices once silenced to speak. The transformation unsettled his executives more than his old rages ever had. They had learned to fear Adrian the predator. They did not know how to follow Adrian the penitent. But in his quiet shifts, small victories emerged. Employees long treated as expendable began to speak of loyalty. Executives, once plotting exits, found themselves curious if change could last. The empire had not collapsed, but swayed precariously between ruin and rebirth. In private, Adrian wrestled with doubt. Could a man remake himself after decades of cruelty? Or was he dressing failure in softer words? Each night he replayed Clara's eyes, the fire in them, the accusation, the faint glimmer of something unspoken. Hope perhaps, or maybe just the ghost of Evelyn whispering through their daughter. He returned again and again to the thought that redemption was not a destination, but a road, and one stumble could erase every step. Damien's challenge grew louder. A faction of the board began drafting contingency plans. A vote loomed unspoken. Adrian knew that soon he would face a reckoning, not just as a father, but as a leader. The empire demanded a predator. The daughter demanded a man. And somewhere in between, Adrian Veyron had to decide which he would be. Rebellion within was not merely political. It was spiritual. It was the tearing apart of the mask he had worn for 30 years. The empire might collapse. The fortune might burn. But in the rubble, perhaps something truer could rise. Adrian stood at the precipice, knowing the choice before him was not between power and weakness. It was between the man he had become and the man he had once promised to be. Autumn laid a thin grey veil over New Haven when Clara Monroe made the call. Her voice on the line was hesitant, carrying the fragile weight of an invitation. "I am driving up this weekend," she said, "to visit her grave. I thought maybe you would want to come." The words settled into Adrian Veyron's chest heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He agreed without hesitation, though his voice trembled more than he wished. The drive northward was mostly silent. Clara kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. Adrian sat beside her. A man accustomed to commanding rooms now reduced to stillness. He glanced at her profile. The resemblance to Evelyn Monroe undeniable, the stubborn line of her jaw, the intensity of her gaze. Even her silence spoke of Evelyn's quiet strength. He wanted to talk, to tell her 1,000 things, yet every phrase died before reaching his lips. The only sound was the hum of the tires over cracked asphalt, and the occasional rustle of autumn leaves swept across the windshield. They arrived at a small cemetery on the edge of town, where crooked headstones leaned toward one another as if whispering old secrets. The air was sharp, and there was a smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. Clara led the way down a narrow path between rows of graves. Adrian followed, his steps unsteadily. However, he had faced the battlefields of finance without fear. At last they stopped before a simple granite marker. Evelyn Monroe, beloved mother. She lit up the world.
Adrian felt the breath leave him. He had braced himself, but nothing could shield him from the sight. His knees weakened. He remembered Evelyn not as this cold name etched in stone, but as the young woman who once argued about poetry, who laughed at his terrible jokes, who believed in him when he was nothing but a boy with holes in his shoes. He saw her smile, her green eyes alive with light. And now she was here, beneath the earth, while he stood above, surrounded by everything he had built and nothing that mattered.
Clara knelt first, placing a hand on the stone. Her shoulders were straight, but he saw the tremor in her fingers. She whispered words Adrian could not hear, then fell silent, allowing the wind to carry her grief. He stood behind, frozen, caught between the instinct to step closer and the fear that he had no right. Finally, he lowered himself beside her. A single white rose rested in his hand. He had bought it from a vendor near the library, the same place he once bought roses for Evelyn when they were both students. He laid it gently on the stone. He wanted to speak, but no words came. His throat constricted, his eyes burned. Clara turned her head and, for the first time since the night in the restaurant, her gaze softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition of shared sorrow. She saw not Adrian Veyron, the Titan, but a man mourning a woman who had shaped them both differently. They remained there for a long time.
The world hushed around them. Only the crunch of leaves and the caw of a distant crow breaking the silence. When they finally rose to leave, the silence followed them, but it was a different silence, not heavy with accusation, but with possibility. As they walked back toward the car, Clara finally spoke. She would have been happy, you know, to see you here, to see us trying. Her words struck him more deeply than any boardroom betrayal, more than any market loss. They carried the weight of Evelyn's faith, which was resurrected in her daughter's voice. Adrian turned to look at her, his eyes brimming. She did not look away. Tangled in decades, he felt something more enduring than power, more enduring than conquest. He felt the fragile beginning of a connection. It was not forgiveness, but it was hope, and hope was a currency more valuable than any fortune he had ever amassed. They reached the car, the silence returning, but now companionable. Clara drove them back toward the city. At the same time, Adrian stared at the landscape streaked with fading color. He thought of the empire waiting for the rebellion festering within his company. Yet for once, those battles seemed secondary. What mattered was beside him at the wheel.
a daughter scarred but unbroken, a chance fragile but alive. He closed his eyes. He allowed himself to imagine a world where legacy was measured not in towers of glass, but in the endurance of love long deferred. The silent pilgrimage to Evelyn Monroe's grave had not erased his sins, but it had opened a door, and for Adrian Veyron, that was more terrifying and more precious than any empire he had ever built.
Winter crept into the city, with its glass towers shivering under gray skies. Adrian Veyron stood in his office, watching snow drift like ash across the skyline. The empire stretched before him. Contracts, mergers, portfolios, all waiting for his command. Yet for the first time in decades, he felt no hunger for conquest. The memory of Clara Monroe's voice lingered in his ears, and the quiet of Evelyn's grave pressed against his chest. His life had been measured in acquisitions. Still, he understood that redemption demanded a different currency, far more costly than money. The board had grown restless. Damien Cross in particular fanned the flames of discontent. He promised shareholders a return to the ruthless predator they had invested in. He painted Adrian's new vision of fair mergers and employee protections as weakness, as sentimentality that would bleed the company dry. Adrian faced them in the boardroom one last time. He did not bring spreadsheets or graphs. He brought conviction.
"We are not a predator anymore," he told them. "We will not destroy lives for profit. We will build instead of break." The room erupted with anger. Shouts of betrayal, accusations of madness. Damien's voice cut above the rest. "Your empire will collapse, Adrian. The market will eat you alive, and when it does, remember, you chose this." Adrian looked at him steadily. Maybe collapse is the only way something better can grow. The silence that followed was bitter but undeniable. For the first time, his words were not those of a conqueror, but of a man choosing a different kind of legacy.
Eyes outside the boardroom, Adrian began his quiet rebellion. He met with employees not as a tyrant, but as a man seeking to listen. He dismantled policies that crushed workers. He established protections for those long discarded. The empire bent under the strain of change. Profits dipped, analysts mocked. Yet beneath the surface, something fragile began to grow. A loyalty born not of fear, but of belief. Victor Hale watched the transformation with cautious respect and whispered, "Perhaps redemption was contagious." Clara remained cautious. She agreed to occasional meetings, always on her terms, in small coffee shops or public libraries. They spoke awkwardly at first, circling the void between them. Still, slowly, stories emerged. She told him about her childhood, Evelyn's courage, and the years of scraping by on nothing. Adrian listened, truly listened, without interruption. Each word was a reminder of the cost of his absence. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for forgiveness.
He received her truth. Then, one afternoon, Clara placed a worn leather journal on the table. It was Evelyn's. Adrian opened it and saw his younger self reflected in the pages. Notes, poems, fragments of dreams shared in cramped apartments. The final entry bore a dedication. "For Artie, my brilliant star. May you light up the world." The name stabbed through him. Not Adrian, not Veyron, but Artie. The boy who once believed love could be enough. He closed the journal, tears stinging his eyes. Clara did not reach across the table. She simply watched, allowing him the space to grieve. In point came quietly. Clara called him one evening. Her voice was soft. "I am considering going back to Yale." She said it without expectation, without asking for help. Still, Adrian felt the weight of possibility. He offered no money, no shortcuts, only a promise. I will call to reopen the door. You will walk through it on your own merit. That is what your mother would have wanted. Clara was silent momentarily, then whispered, "Thank you." It was the closest she had come to acknowledging his efforts. Weeks later, father and daughter drove together to New Haven. The campus was alive with students, laughter spilling across quads, snow crunching beneath hurried footsteps. They visited Evelyn's grave once more, this time together, not as strangers bound by blood, but as two people trying to rebuild what time had shattered. Adrian placed another white rose on the stone. Clara stood beside him and said softly, "She would have been proud to see you here, to see us trying." In that moment, Adrian felt something bloom inside him, not triumph, not conquest, but hope, fragile and luminous. The empire of steel and glass he had once worshipped seemed hollow compared to the quiet bond forming between them. Redemption, he realized, was not a destination but a road. It demanded humility, effort, and pain. It demanded the courage to face mistakes, not bury them. It demanded patience to build something brick by painful brick. As snow fell gently over the cemetery, Adrian turned to Clara. Her green eyes, clear and unflinching, met his. For the first time he saw not judgment, but possibility. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with missteps and trials. Still, he welcomed the struggle for the first time in his life. True wealth was not in vaults or towers. It was in the chance to be seen, forgiven, and loved. Adrian Veyrong, the emperor of capital, had fallen. But in his place, a man began to rise. A father, a seeker, a man who finally understood the price of redemption and was willing to pay it.